When underwater atomic testing unleashes an ancient beast of legendary size and ferocity, a scientist must wrestle with the prospect of using a newly developed technology with enormous destructive potential to end the carnage. This is the premise of the original 1954 Kaiju classic, Godzilla, directed by Ishiro Honda, and that's the movie we'll be dusting off today on Movie Bones. I've got a bit of a confession to make to you folks out there that while it's true that I have watched my fair share of city-stomping kaiju monster films over the years, the one thing that linked them all together is the theater seat-back silhouettes and the wisecracking robots. And if you're familiar with that, you know what I mean, enough said. If not, well then, you might have a very different sense of humor than I do, and that's all right. But you know what else is all right, folks? This movie. And I wasn't convinced going into it that I was going to come out feeling that way, because if you've seen enough B movies, and especially enough of kaiju B movies, it's like you have a certain expectation built up. I'm very glad, Ryan, this film kind of bucked that trend for me. I didn't know what I was going to be in for, and it was a pleasant surprise, I have to say. So folks, you know the movie that we're talking about this week is the first, Godzilla, the original 1954 Ishiro Honda film produced for Toho Studio, which would go on to spawn countless other films starring the Big G-Man, and it even would go on to inspire the Toho rival Daiei Studios to create the lesser-known but still popular Gamera franchise. It begins with a series of mysterious attacks on fishing vessels off the coast of Japan, followed by the requisite number of strange discoveries like giant radioactive footprints and thought to be extinct trilobites within them, indicating that whatever made the footprint also has ancient origins. There's also the genre standard sequences of official meetings with scientists and random locals being terrorized. There's a personal drama between an older scientist who doesn't want to see the creature destroyed, his daughter with fiancé, and the daughter's former scientist/lover interest, Dr. Serizawa, whose new but destructive discovery may hold the ultimate key to defeat Godzilla. And that's the setup, Brian. And of the two of us, I know you've got one up on me in this particular genre, at least when it comes to the non-MST3K enjoyment of them. So why don't I just turn the floor over to you and see what kind of like deeper historical roots that this icon of Japanese cinema has built on, and why maybe you think this has gained so much of a following that's still with us today.
I watched this movie in its entirety for the first time last year. For those of you who don't know, I'm going to give you a little bit of history lesson from my own personal life and kind of Justin's as well. We had been meeting just to talk about just random things, where we're going in life, things like that. And that's what kind of inspired this podcast, because I had started watching old films. Justin and his wife had already also loved old films. At one point I said, you know what, I'm actually going to watch the original Godzilla movie. And when a lot of people think original Godzilla movie, they think of the Americanized version. And I'm not talking about like what came out in the early 2000s. I'm talking about the one with
I always want to say Orson Welles, but it's not Orson Welles. It's
not Orson Welles. It's the guy that played Perry Mason. And so what that movie is, I want to talk just very briefly about that movie. That movie is a literal shot-for-shot remake. And when I say literal shot-for-shot remake, all they did was they superimposed him into the movie. They switched it up a little bit. And he's just a reporter. Like, I think they did that brilliantly, because he doesn't necessarily affect the movie. It's just like you're seeing it from an American's perspective. And also, that particular movie is American propaganda. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, because it didn't mean anything wrong. So the original movie, it takes place in 1954, I want to say. I could be wrong, but 1954. What happens 9 years before that? If you don't know, please open a history book. But what happens 9 years before that is the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nagasaki, sorry. And this is a response to that. But it's not like a response in a way that is, oh, America bad. They don't shy away like, this is not a good thing. Like, they kind of are telling us, like, anybody that does this, we're going to probably circle back in on that a little bit later.
We will be circling back into the themes here. Yeah.
But what this movie is, it's a self-critique. And that's what makes this movie so beautiful and brilliant, is that it's a self-critique of imperialistic Japan, which was destroyed by World War II, and a dawning of a new age in Japan. And Godzilla represents not the old ways, but Godzilla represents massive change in that world. And that's what makes this movie so endearing to me.
Yeah, I would love to hear you talk more about, like, especially the Imperial Japan part and the self-reflection, because, well, there's some things that exist on the surface in this film, in terms of the scientific self-reflection, the idea of coming up with a new and better scientific weapon to defeat a problem that was generated by a previous scientific weapon of mass destruction. The Imperial aspect, I did not pick up on. Do you know any more about the Imperial connection of that self-reflection?
There is a movie that came out last year called Godzilla -1. You can find it on most streaming services.
It's been making the rounds.
Is where it's at.
Even if I haven't seen it, you probably have heard, or at least, or seen mention of it. Probably.
Godzilla -1 is a better critique on imperialism of Japan and how they conducted themselves. One of the main characters, actually the main character, he was supposed to be a kamikaze pilot. And he did not do the kamikaze pilot part of his job. His area didn't get hit by an atomic warhead, but his area did get hit hard from bombings and such. And a character that he interacts with is upset with him because he did not die. And that sounds so baffling, but it's a critique. It's like, and she even says, it's people like you are the reason why we didn't win. Because you didn't die.
And this is from the new one? The new Godzilla?
This is from the new one. It is a love letter to the first one, and it is also an extended conversation of what the original one is trying to say. Yeah, a lot of what the original one is saying is we don't need to go back to our old ways. And you get that kind of there at the end with Dr. Sarakawa.
Sarakawa. His name. I have to...
Surazawa. His whole thing is, the reason why he does not want to do the things that he does, or the things that he's used what he's created, because he feels like if we use this, then, or if we start mass producing this, then what's going to happen is we're just going to go back into our old ways, and we're not going to be any better off. In fact, we're going to become more destructive than we were beforehand. Now, I also want to say this too, like, if you know anything about Imperial Japan, it's done a lot of horrible things. You're not going to get any of those horrible things, minus like wartime stuff, but you're not going to get those atrocities. They're not going to tell them. They're too ashamed of them. Japan, was in a horrible way in that world, in that time period. And again, these movies are a reflection on themselves, and the monsters we create, and the monsters that we could create, and the monsters that we unleash because of our hubris. I would say, maybe that's the right word, because of our hubris.
Yeah. And it's interesting because of it's like how empires respond when they fall, right, is a key part of how things play out going forward. And there are different degrees here. It's like, I know that Germany did a complete kind of, I think Mein Kampf is actually a outlawed book, which in our Western eyes is often a thing, especially in the United States. The idea of banning a book is anathema to us. And yet you can still see why they did that, but it was a complete rejection of what came before. Now, part of that had to do with, the exposing of the atrocities, which I'm not sure if that ever happened in Imperial Japan the same way. Part of the reason why we had that in Europe with Germany was because we did a land invasion, right? And before we ever got to the land invasion of Imperial Japan, we dropped the bombs. The people there were never had to come face to face with those things. And the natural human inclination is to avoid that. It is good to see that, that kind of Godzilla becomes kind of sort of an attempt to start to reconcile these ideas, at least, and I can start to see how you get there. And sometimes you do have to fly it under the radar through the lens, so to speak, of science fiction. And in the United States, we've got our own problems, and we've talked about this with, To Kill a Mockingbird and the other movies, how we struggle with coming to terms with our own demons. Every culture has its demons. How well you confront them and the necessity of confronting them is something I find fascinating. when the film started, I kind of had my B-movie goggles on, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I'm very attuned to the tropes of B movies, especially in all kinds of B movies. And the tropes here, you get these scientists talking with experts and experts talking with scientists. And you have a bunch of local villagers who die instantaneously. And you have a boatload of stock footage. And it felt in that point to me, it's like, here we go. All this is kind of dead to me because I feel like it's just kind of rote information. I've seen it so many times and it doesn't actually give you any shred of what the heart of the film is at yet. And then gradually, I start to notice a few things. First of all, the kind of stereotypical shot where you see villagers being squashed or their homes being torn apart and dying. They actually hired some pretty good actors to do what is basically a throwaway role. So because actually there's a house that gets destroyed and the reactions those actors had was so believable enough that it's like I actually felt a little bit of something where in a lot of other B movies it's like flatlining, right? That was one thing. And so you start to pick up on that a little bit. But when the film really hits its stride, somewhere in the middle of the second act, the daughter and the kind of boyfriend character, they end up having this other friend who's a scientist, and it was also like the daughter's ex-boyfriend. And he's developed something in secret. It's like this super, kind of just treat it like it's the atomic bomb 2.0. It's made clear this is really super powerful, and if in the wrong hands, this could be as disastrous as anything that we've come up with before, including the atomic bomb. The moment that you start to focus on these three, and as the film does, that's when the movie really takes off for me.
And I think that, the elder of the group, if I'm correct, I think part of like his motivation behind isn't just like, hey, this is a creature and we should protect all kinds of life. He's kind of playing the position of a person that's asking the question, this is our fault, so we should live with our mistakes. We woke Godzilla up, so we don't deserve to put Godzilla back to sleep or to get rid of Godzilla because, again, it's our fault for doing this kind of stuff. You have the other character who has created something, and his whole position is this could be useful. Like he brings it up. He said this could actually be a useful tool, but I know it can be weaponized, and because I know it can be weaponized, I don't want us to go down that route.
He does a great job. He's my favorite character in the whole film. He's like anguished over this discovery of his to the point where he's willing to take the ultimate sacrifice to keep this from getting outside of his own lab. It makes him a very moral character in that sense. He is desperate to try and protect humanity from this grave threat. Most of us will never have to deal with that kind of pain, but he actually portrays it really well.
I can tell you from watching this movie and doing a little bit of the studies that I've done on it, that Japan themselves, while they might have lamented at the time, we wish the bombs weren't dropped on us, they were looking at themselves and asking, how did we get to this point? That's what they were asking themselves. How did we get to this point that this happened to us? As bad as it is, and as much as we didn't want it to happen, and even as upset with the USA for doing it, they still are asking themselves, how did we get to this point right here?
Yeah.
And Godzilla is a reflection of all of that. I know it sounds bizarre a little bit because oftentimes when we think of Godzilla, we think of the new Godzilla movie, and I'm talking about Godzilla and the Kong movies. They're fun movies. They're about giant monsters fighting. And who doesn't like giant monsters fighting? Whether you're watching it ironically or unironically.
When you watch in this case, it's a Godzilla puppet. And I think that's cute, by the way. Godzilla being cute puppet, that's a feather in the cap for the movie, too.
Yeah.
But there's a great humility at the heart of it. And I think that we as Americans, especially right now, where America is at right now. Have you ever heard of like liminal spaces or liminal phases?
Yes.
Liminal spaces are those places like airports and hallways. It's basically a transition space. And when you apply that to phases of our history, we are in a liminal phase of our history right now, much as Japan was in a liminal phase of not knowing who it was in the wake of World War II. And here we are in the 2020s, and America is going through this very liminal phase where we don't know where we're going to end up. For me personally, as mentioned, I was going in, this was a hard sell for me. And the early going had me worried that it was going to be bad dates. As there are many a kaiju film that have ended up as some sort of nuke the fridge for me in the past. And so I had reason to worry. But at the same time, I sensed there was something in the original that had to be there if it's still like caused this tidal wave of sequels and whatnot. So, while it isn't a perfect film, I'm just not going to go straight to the top, but I think this is actually going to end up as, Trust Me. And I did not know I was going to go there. I thought I was going to end up in a museum, but this is going to be actually Trust Me. How about you, man?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of kaiju movies that, again, you're just watching it for the thrill of it. And by the thrill of it, I mean just giant monsters fighting each other. Believe it or not, this is not a standalone Godzilla movie. This is just a first in a line of many. And if you're watching the end of this movie, you're going, well, how is that even possible? They tell you in Godzilla, I think Godzilla Destroy All Monsters, it's the second movie and everything. And because it's like, oh, well, there's more than one Godzilla type of ordeal.
I think they did mention something at the end that,
there could be more.
There would be more. So it leaves the door open for that, at least, yeah. But
again, there's a Godzilla movie out there where he does a drop kick.
Oh, yeah.
It's one of the coolest things ever, and your brain is supposed to be completely turned off for that.
Is that the one? I got to ask, is that the one in the opening for Mystery Science Theater? For the longest time, they had a Godzilla clip, and it's him just being. It's obviously the man's not in the suit. It's just the suit on strings held horizontally, and they're just sending it across horizontally to kick like this flying kick.
That is the Godzilla drop kick.
Okay. Yeah, and he does it, and the thing is, he doesn't do it just once. It's at least twice. It's so good he had to do it again.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, as it goes on, you could turn your brain off because you're going, okay, this movie, we don't have to take it as seriously because, again, it's just fighting monsters and everything. And now I'm sure there's some serious ones. I haven't watched through them all yet. Plan on doing that eventually, just because. But the first movie had a story to tell. It had a message to convey. It is a true horror story because it is about real world, real life tech ramifications. The ramifications of that real life tech. Because again, you're in a world that was directly 9 years prior. These people that are in this movie, all of them, besides like the children, and there's not very many children, but all of them, they knew somebody. They probably had family members. Who knows? Some of them might have actually been in the area, but just, managed to survive in one way or another. Because people did survive those blasts.
Yeah.
So it is a stark warning on society. It's a self-reflection, and it comes in the form of a giant monster.
Yeah. And how beautiful is that?
It's so beautiful. And again, we look at it now and we're thinking, oh, cool, giant monster. And I even went into it going, I love Godzilla. I've always loved Godzilla. When I really sat down and listened to what they were saying and watched and saw the message, I was like, oh, wow, this movie is something else. It's not just a giant monster movie. It's everything I've already described.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, as I said last week, for those of you that listened, go back and listen to last week. This is a Fortune and Glory. It's a pure gold film, and it will always be that way for me. And I am thankful for the movies that spawn from it. But watch this movie. And if you want to continue that particular conversation that this movie is making, go watch Godzilla -1, because it goes back to the original and is going back to the original conversation the first movie's having.
Does it actually go back to the actual 1940s, 50s?
Yeah, it takes place in there.
That actually makes me kind of want to see it now.
There are some scenes, believe it or not, that you can tell they were heavily inspired by. Like the movies are different in their own ways of how they decide to end it all. But there are some scenes like you can see the one-to-one comparison to certain scenes. One of the more iconic Godzilla scenes, I remember it being in -1, but Godzilla at the train station, that's one of them. They're in both films. And then another one is the reporters on top of the roof.
Okay, I was wondering if that would be the other one. Because I thought that was pretty iconic in the film. Yeah.
Yeah, those are both in both the Godzilla movies. They're having a conversation about looking inward on ourselves. So, Fortune and Glory.
At this time, folks, we'd like to remind you that if you're new to the show and are enjoying our shared adventure in film history, to leave your own thoughts on these films in our comment section, whether that's on YouTube or Facebook. Make some suggestions for films you'd like us to see do in the future, and if you haven't already, click the follow button on your podcast purveyor of choice so you never miss an episode. And on that note, Ryan, tell the folks what next week's film is.
So I actually did not know this film existed until you brought it up to me. And I thought, if you just hear the name, folks, it's just titled David and Lisa.
David and Lisa.
I'm not gonna give anything else away, but I can tell you, I think this is going to be a psychological movie.
I think you'd be correct in that assessment. So yeah, folks, that's next week's assignment. Please join us to watch it in advance if you can, and if you can't, you're welcome to join us anyway. That's about all there is to say for this week. So I guess I'll just see you next week, Ryan, and have a great one.
All right, you too, man.
All right, folks, you guys have a great one too. Bye-bye.